"It seems there's a slight mix-up, sir," came the voice of Laura Bennett, a flight attendant on the Starlight Airlines flight from Memphis, Tennessee, to Portland, Oregon, echoing through the first-class cabin. She stood beside seat 2A, where Clarence Cliff Turner, a 70-year-old black man, with silver hair and a weathered face, was seated. Laura's tone was polite, but carried an unmistakable hint of arrogance she couldn't quite mask. "We need you to give up your seat to accommodate one of our VIP passengers. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories." Cliff looked up at her, his deep black eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't speak right away, just quietly observed Laura, who wore a crisp uniform, her blonde hair tied back tightly, though her gaze betrayed her impatience. Behind her stood Eleanor Ellie Prescott, an elegantly dressed white woman, clutching a designer handbag, tapping her fingers on the expensive watch around her wrist. Ellie glanced at Cliff, then at the seat he occupied, 2A, as if it were her personal property he was stealing. "I always sit there," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "It's practically my seat." Cliff tilted his head slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He had booked his ticket early, paid in full, and arrived on time. He was a platinum member of Starlight Airlines. Having chosen this seat for the legroom, his aching knees demanded after decades of work and surviving injustices he'd never forget. Yet now, his presence was being treated as a mistake to be corrected. He calmly reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his platinum membership card and boarding pass, and placed them on the armrest. "I'm a platinum member," he said, his voice steady and unshaken, "and this is my assigned seat." Laura's smile stiffened, a flash of surprise crossing her face, quickly replaced by determination. "I understand, sir," she replied, her tone tight, "but this seat is typically reserved for our extra special platinum members." She tilted her head toward Ellie, who still stood there, glaring at Cliff, as if he were an annoying obstacle. "This is a frequent customer of ours, who always flies with us," Laura continued, her implication clear. Regardless of Cliff's status, he didn't belong here. Nearby passengers began to take notice. Phones slipped out of pockets, whispers rippling through the first-class cabin. Cliff remained still, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, his eyes fixed on Laura. He was all too familiar with moments like this, being pushed out of spaces he rightfully occupied, just because of his skin or his appearance. But today, he wasn't about to yield. "I booked this seat," he said again, his voice still calm but firmer. "I have a right to be here." Laura shifted her stance, clearly uncomfortable with Cliff's resistance. Ellie Prescott made no effort to hide her irritation. She stepped forward, her voice rising to draw attention. "I don't understand why this is such a hassle," she said, glancing around, as if seeking allies. "An old man like you should know your place. I need this seat. I have important business in Portland." Her words were sharp, dripping with entitlement, thickening the tension in the cabin. Cliff didn't respond immediately. He just looked at Ellie, his gaze deep and measured. He'd heard words like that his whole life, words that belittled, insulted, and each time they left an invisible scar. But before he could say anything, Laura leaned closer, her voice lowered, but carrying unmistakable pressure. "Sir, we have another platinum member, who always takes this seat," she said. "Would you mind moving to a different one?" Though phrased as a question, it sounded like an order, as if she was certain Cliff would comply. Cliff shook his head slightly. "No thank you," he replied, his tone calm but resolute. "I chose this seat because I need the legroom. I'm staying here." He pressed his hand more firmly on the armrest, a small but clear signal he wasn't budging. Laura's smile shrank to a thin line. She gave a curt nod, then turned and strode quickly toward the front of the cabin, occasionally glancing back at Cliff with annoyance. The atmosphere in first class began to shift. A few passengers muttered, and a young man, Malik Jordan, seated a few rows away, raised his phone, its lens trained on Cliff and Laura. The faint click of the camera sounded in the quiet space. Ellie Prescott remained standing, Not bothering to mask her frustration, she sighed dramatically, looking around as if wanting the whole cabin to witness her inconvenience. "This is unbelievable," she said loudly. "I always fly Starlight and have never been treated like this." Her words weren't aimed at anyone specific, but they were clearly meant to pile more pressure on Cliff. Cliff didn't react. He sat upright, his gaze drifting to the window, though his ears caught every sound. He knew this wasn't over, and he was right. What the crew didn't know was that this incident would change everything, not just for them but for the airline they served. Cliff wasn't just any passenger. He was a man who'd quietly held their fate in his hands, and his resolve today would soon prove it. The air in the first-class cabin of the Starlight Airlines flight from Memphis to Portland grew heavy after Laura Bennett walked away. Clarence Cliff Turner stayed seated in 2A, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, his eyes on the window but his mind fully attuned to what had just happened. He knew what was coming next, the familiar next steps in a script he'd seen too many times in his life. The murmurs from nearby passengers grew louder, and Malik Jordan, the young man a few rows back, kept his phone raised, its lens locked on Cliff. Just minutes later, Laura returned, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her was Nate Sullivan, the first-class supervisor, a tall man with a confident stride and a cold face. Nate stopped by Cliff's seat, hands on his hips, looking down at him with an air of superiority he surely thought was authoritative. "Sir," he began, his voice loud enough for those around to hear, "we need you to move to accommodate a VIP passenger. This isn't a request, it's an instruction." Cliff looked up, his eyes calm but unwavering. He'd faced men like Nate before, those who wielded power to cloak injustice. "I showed the flight attendant my ticket and platinum card," he replied, his voice even. "This is my seat. What policy requires me to give it up?" His question wasn't a challenge but a logical demand, yet it made Nate pause, a muscle in his cheek twitching faintly. Eleanor Ellie Prescott, still hovering behind, couldn't hide her impatience. She stepped closer, clutching her bag tightly, her voice rising in theatrical frustration. "This is ridiculous," she said, glancing around for attention. "I have critical business in Portland right after we land. I need that seat. My seat. An old man like you shouldn't make this so complicated." Her words cut like a blade, and Cliff felt the contempt in every syllable. Before Nate could address Cliff's question, Ellie leaned toward Laura, deftly slipping a folded stack of bills into the flight attendant's uniform pocket. The move was quick but not discreet enough to escape the watching eyes. "Thanks for helping me sort this," Ellie whispered, just loud enough for a few nearby passengers to catch. "First class needs standards." Laura flushed but didn't refuse, her hand subtly pressing the pocket to conceal the money. Cliff saw it all. He didn't blink, but inside, a small ember of anger flared. He'd seen this game before, money traded for privilege, no matter who got hurt. Yet he kept his composure, turning to Nate. "I'm still waiting for an answer," he said, his tone unchanged. "What policy forces me to leave my booked seat?" Nate cleared his throat, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned. He leaned closer to Cliff, his voice dropping but still audible in the quiet cabin. "Maybe you're not used to how things work on this flight," he said, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child. "We prioritize deserving customers with special preferences. You can make this easy, or we'll make it harder. Your choice." The threat hung in the air. Nearby passengers stirred. Malik Jordan adjusted his camera angle, his eyes flashing with indignation. An older woman in a back row shook her head, whispering to her neighbor. Cliff didn't move. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. 6 simple words delivered with unyielding certainty. No anger, just absolute resolve. Nate's face reddened, clearly unprepared for this defiance. He straightened, adjusted his uniform tie, and spun on his heel, marching briskly to the front of the cabin. He picked up the service phone, his back to the passengers, but his furious gestures were unmistakable. Meanwhile, Ellie sighed theatrically, checking her watch again. "I can't believe this," she declared. "I'll be late for my meeting over this nonsense." The tension in the cabin peaked as the cockpit door swung open. Rob Dawson, the flight's captain, stepped out. his weathered face carrying a professional sternness. He followed Nate down the aisle, Laura trailing silently behind, visibly uneasy with the escalating situation. Rob's presence hushed the cabin. This was no longer a minor dispute, but an official intervention. Rob stopped by Cliff's seat, towering and imposing as he looked down. "Sir," he began, his voice deep and commanding, "I understand there's an issue. My crew has the authority to reassign seats for the comfort and convenience of all passengers." His tone was steady, but it carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed without debate. Cliff met his gaze, facing all three standing before him, Laura, Nate, and Rob. The odds were uneven, 3 standing, 1 seated, but he didn't flinch. "I respect you, Captain," Cliff replied, his voice still firm, "but I have a confirmed ticket and platinum status. I chose this seat for health reasons. No policy requires me to give it up just because someone else wants it." Nate cut in, his lips curling into a smirk. "If you keep being stubborn, we'll have to remove you from this flight," he said, the threat landing like a blow. Cliff raised an eyebrow, the first hint of surprise since this began. "You're threatening to kick me off for not giving up the seat I paid for?" he asked, his tone reflecting disbelief. Before Rob could respond, Ellie interrupted, her voice shrill with outrage. "This is absurd," she shouted. "I'll miss my connection. I've never been treated this badly." The irony of her words wasn't lost on the other passengers, some exchanging incredulous looks. Rob, perhaps sensing the situation slipping out of control, hardened his stance. "This is your final warning," he said. "Move seats, or we'll call security." Cliff didn't answer right away. He slowly pulled his phone from his pocket, opened the camera app, and began recording. "I want to get this on record," he said, his voice calm, aiming the phone at the 3 in front of him. "I'm being threatened with removal from this flight for not giving up my assigned seat to someone else." Nate lunged forward angrily, his hand nearly grabbing the phone. "Filming isn't allowed," he barked. Cliff pulled back just in time. "There's no law stopping me from recording to protect myself," he replied, his legal knowledge making Nate freeze. Cliff closed his eyes for a moment, and in that instant, he wasn't on the flight from Memphis to Portland anymore. He was back in 1965, a 20-year-old military pilot in the U.S. Air Force. That time he'd been in full uniform, chest adorned with commendation pins, boarding a domestic flight from Memphis to visit family. He'd saved for months to afford a first-class ticket, hoping for equal treatment after months of fighting for his country. But as soon as he sat down, a flight attendant, a white man with a fake smile, approached him. "There's been a mistake, son," the man said, his tone sugary but icy. "This seat isn't for people like you." Cliff, young and fiery then, tried to explain. He showed his ticket, pointed to the seat number clearly printed, but the attendant wouldn't even look. "You don't belong here," he cut in, then called security. In front of the other passengers, all white, some snickering, others looking away, Cliff was dragged from his seat, arms twisted behind him, and escorted off the plane. He heard someone whisper, "Should have known his place," and a faint laugh sliced into his pride like a knife. Standing outside the airport, uniform rumpled, Cliff watched the plane take off without him, and vowed, "One day, I'll change this industry." That memory never left him. It was the fire that drove Cliff through the tough years that followed, promotions denied in the military because of his race, sleepless nights studying extra skills to prove his worth. When he retired, he began quietly investing in aviation, using his modest savings to buy shares in Starlight Airlines, an up-and-coming carrier he hoped to reshape from within. Over decades, he amassed a 25% stake, not for wealth, but for a voice. So one day, he could force the industry to face its wrongs. Back in the present, the sound of security's footsteps snapped Cliff out of his reverie. He opened his eyes to see 2 men in uniform approaching, hands resting on their belts, as if he were a threat. Nate Sullivan stood behind, pointing at Cliff with a triumphant smirk, while Laura Bennett stepped back, her gaze averted. Rob Dawson, the captain, stood a few paces away, his face tense but uninvolved. Eleanor Ellie. Prescott smirked, clearly pleased to see Cliff on the verge of being removed. But Cliff wasn't afraid. The memory of 1965 wasn't just a wound, it was strength. Back then, he'd had no one to stand with him, no phone to record, no power to push back. Today was different. He'd spent a lifetime preparing for this moment, and he wouldn't let it pass without a fight. His phone kept recording, capturing every detail. Nate's threatening tone, Ellie's smug grin, Rob's complicit silence. He knew, as he'd known 50 years ago, that justice didn't come on its own. It had to be demanded. "Sir," one of the security guards spoke, his tone stiff. "We've been told there's a situation requiring your removal from the plane." Cliff nodded slightly, still composed. "I'd like to know what policy I violated," he said, his voice clear. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat with a valid ticket and platinum status." Out in the Memphis airport lounge, security released his arms, one of them muttering, "Sorry for the inconvenience," before walking off looking sheepish. Cliff didn't reply. He sat on a lounge chair, placed his phone on the table, and stopped the recording. The screen showed Rob Dawson's tense face, Nate's threatening voice, and the moment Ellie slipped money into Laura Bennett's pocket. He watched it for a moment, his deep eyes glinting with resolve, then picked up the phone to call Dorothy Phillips, his old lawyer from his military advocacy days. "It's me," Cliff said, when she answered, his voice low but steady. "I just got kicked off a Starlight Airlines flight for not giving up my booked seat to a white passenger. They took money from her to do it. I need you to start a lawsuit right away." Dot's voice came through, as fierce as ever. "Cliff, I'm on it. Send me everything you've got." He nodded, though she couldn't see, and added, "I've got video. I'll send it soon." Next, Cliff texted Sam Carter, a Portland journalist he knew from interviews about civil rights in aviation. "Sam, I just got discriminated against by Starlight on a flight to Portland. Got video proof. Can you run the story?" The message barely sent before his phone buzzed. A social media notification popped up, a video posted by Malik Jordan, the young man from the flight. Cliff opened it. The caption read, "Black old man kicked off first-class seat for white woman. Starlight Airlines bribery exposed." It already had thousands of views in minutes. Cliff replayed Malik's footage. It started with Laura asking him to move, capturing Ellie's clear taunt, "An old man like you should know your place," and the moment she slipped money into Laura's pocket. Nate's threat rang sharp, "We'll make it harder," alongside Rob's final warning. Passengers in the video murmured in outrage, one voice cutting through, "He didn't do anything wrong." Cliff recognized it as Malik's. Views skyrocketed, 50,000, then 100,000, as he watched. The hashtag #StarlightDiscrimination began trending, spreading like wildfire. A new message arrived. It was from Grace Harper, another passenger on the flight. "Mr. Turner," it read, "I recorded the whole thing from when the attendant approached you to when they kicked you off. I couldn't sit by and watch this. I sent you the full video via email. Call me if you need a witness." Cliff checked his email and saw the attachment, a crisp, unobstructed video, capturing every detail, including Ellie whispering, "Thanks for keeping standards," as she handed Laura the money. He smiled faintly, the first time since boarding. "Thank you, Grace," he texted back. "This will help a lot." Cliff opened his phone's voice recorder, narrating the incident in a low, clear tone. "They asked me to give up seat 2A, despite my ticket and platinum status. Flight attendant Laura Bennett said it was for a better customer. Ellie Prescott gave her money in front of me. Nate Sullivan threatened security, and Captain Rob Dawson approved my removal." He paused, recalling Laura's averted gaze, Ellie's smirk, and Rob's silent complicity. He saved the file and sent it to Dot, along with both videos. Meanwhile, a security guard returned, looking uneasy. "Sir," he said, hesitating, "I think there might have been a misunderstanding. The report said you were disruptive, but some passengers say otherwise." Cliff fixed him with a sharp gaze. "The misunderstanding wasn't mine," he replied. "I was removed for not giving up my rightful seat to someone else just because they wanted it. She paid them to prioritize her." The guard stepped back, at a loss for words, then left with his partner. At Starlight Airlines headquarters in Phoenix, Arizona, the air in the top-floor boardroom was thick like a storm about to break. George Greg Mitchell, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, flipping through the latest quarterly financials when the intercom buzzed. He picked it up, slightly irritated. "What is it, Becky?" On the other end was Rebecca "Becky" Lawson, the PR director, her voice shaky but urgent. "Sir, we've got a serious problem. A video's going viral. A passenger was removed from this morning's Memphis to Portland flight. It's blowing up." Greg sighed, leaning back in his leather chair, initially unbothered. "Passengers get removed for disruptions all the time, Becky. Just issue the usual statement." But Becky's voice cut in, more frantic. "No, sir, this is different. He wasn't disruptive. He's an older black man, legitimately in first class, forced to give up his seat for a white woman. The video shows our staff taking money from her before and after he was removed." Silence stretched for seconds, Greg's face paling as the gravity sank in. "Send me the video now," he ordered, his voice dropping. Becky emailed the file, and Greg pulled it up on the wall's big screen, playing Malik Jordan's clip. Now past 5 million views. The footage was crystal clear. Laura Bennett asking Clarence Cliff Turner to move. Eleanor Ellie Prescott mocking him as an old man who doesn't know his place. Then Ellie slipping money into Laura's pocket with a whispered "keep standards." Nathan Nate Sullivan's threat, "we'll make it harder," and Robert Rob Dawson's final order before security hauled Cliff away. Cliff's calm throughout, stark against the crew's arrogance, made the scene even more damning. Greg shut off the video, his hand trembling slightly. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Becky hesitated before answering. "According to the manifest, it's Clarence Turner." Silence blanketed the room until Greg snapped, "Which Clarence Turner?" Becky swallowed hard, her voice dropping. "Clarence Cliff Turner, former military pilot, fought discrimination in aviation in the 60s and 70s, and he owns 25% of Starlight Airlines." The blood drained from Greg's face as if he'd been slapped. He slumped back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "He's our biggest shareholder," he muttered, disbelieving. Becky nodded, her voice quivering. "Yes, sir. He bought up shares over years, very quietly. We didn't know, until now." Greg slammed his hand on the table and shot up. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before we kicked him off the plane?" The boardroom door burst open, a young assistant rushing in with a tablet, forgetting protocol. "Sir," he panted, "our stock's crashing down 12% already. Analysts predict a 30% drop by day's end if we don't act." Greg snatched the tablet, staring at the red graph plummeting like a mortal wound. The #Starlight discrimination was now trending nationwide, social media posts flooding with outrage from frequent flyers to celebrities amplifying the story. Greg turned to Becky, his voice urgent. "Call the board now." Within minutes, the room filled with executives, faces taut with stress. One suggested, "We could say he was disruptive, issue a denial," but Becky shook her head. "Won't work. There are at least 2 clear videos. One from him, one from another passenger. The evidence is too strong. Bribery, discrimination, all caught on tape." Another exec proposed, "A public apology. Promise reforms." Greg roared, "An apology won't cut it when stocks are tanking and the guy we removed is our top shareholder." The phone on the table rang, Greg's assistant picking it up, then handing it over with a panicked look. "It's Mr. Turner's office," she whispered. Greg took a deep breath, putting it on speaker. "Turner," he began, his voice strained but attempting warmth, "I want to offer my sincerest apologies for the unacceptable incident this morning." "Save your apologies." Cliff's voice cut through the speaker, low and razor-sharp, interrupting Greg. "As you may know, I own 25% of Starlight Airlines, a controlling stake when combined with my strategic partners. What happened today shows your company culture is rotten to the core. I want an emergency shareholders meeting called immediately." Dead silence gripped the room, executives exchanging panicked glances. Greg stammered, "Mr. Turner, we can handle this internally." But Cliff didn't let him finish. "No negotiation," he said, his voice unwavering. Either accountability, or I pull my entire stake and call on other investors to follow. Your choice. The call ended, leaving the boardroom in chaos. Becky swung her laptop toward Greg, showing the video's views surpassing 7 million. Major news outlets now running headlines like Starlight Airlines, racism and bribery in the skies. A finance exec chimed in, if he pulls 25%, the market will collapse. Other investors will panic. We could go bankrupt. Greg looked around, the harsh truth dawning. The man they'd kicked off the plane now held the company's fate in his hands. Malik's video hit 8 million views, and #Starlight discrimination wasn't just trending nationally, it was going global. The stock dropped another 5% in the minutes after Cliff's call. Greg turned to Becky Lawson, the PR director, his voice hoarse. Get HR on this now. We need to act before he tears it all down. Becky nodded, her hands shaky as she dialed the intercom. Meanwhile, Greg reopened Cliff's self-recorded video on the big screen. Cliff's voice rang out, low and clear. I was threatened with removal for not giving up my assigned seat. Ellie Prescott gave money to Laura Bennett in front of me. Nate's threat and Rob's final order played out, undeniable. Minutes later, HR Director Margaret Maggie Evans stormed into the boardroom with 2 internal security guards. Maggie slapped 3 thick files onto the table, her gaze stern. I've reviewed the passenger and Turner videos, she said, her voice firm. We have enough to act. Greg nodded. No hesitation. Do it. Laura Bennett, Nathan Sullivan, and Robert Dawson, fire them. Effective immediately. Downstairs, in a windowless meeting room, Laura Bennett, Nate Sullivan, and Rob Dawson sat waiting, unease etched on their faces. They'd been summoned without explanation, but company whispers had them on edge. Laura bit her nails, Nate tapped his foot incessantly, and Rob, with his seasoned face, sat still but his eyes betrayed worry. When the door opened, and Maggie walked in with 2 guards, all 3 flinched. I'll get to the point, Maggie said, placing the 3 files on the table. Your employment with Starlight Airlines is terminated effective immediately. The announcement hit like a punch. Laura covered her mouth, choking back a sob. Nate shot up, his face flushed. What? We were just following procedure, he yelled. Rob closed his eyes, as if he'd seen this coming. Maggie opened her laptop, playing Malik's video. Their actions were laid bare. Laura taking money from Ellie Prescott. Nate threatening Cliff with arrogance. Rob standing by without intervening. But the standout moment was Ellie slipping money into Nate's pocket after Cliff's removal, whispering, "Thanks for handling this." Maggie paused the video, eyeing them. Is taking money from a passenger to discriminate part of procedures? She asked, her tone icy. Laura broke down, tears streaming down her cheeks. We messed up, she whispered. I knew it was wrong the moment it happened, but I didn't stop. Nate stayed defiant, his voice rising. He wouldn't cooperate. We were just doing our jobs. But Maggie didn't budge. You failed, not just the company but basic decency, she said. The man you removed is Clarence Turner, our biggest shareholder. The revelation was a second blow. Laura stopped crying, her eyes wide with shock. Nate sank back into his chair, pale. Rob shook his head, his voice faint. I just trusted the crew's judgment, he said. I didn't see the full picture from the start. Maggie snapped her laptop shut. You'll be escorted to collect your personal items and leave. 2 weeks severance will be wired. More than you deserve. The guard stepped forward, gesturing for them to rise. Laura bowed her head. Nate muttered incoherently, and Rob stood slowly, looking decades older. They were led out of the room, walking through a hallway, where colleagues stared with curiosity and distance. In the 5 minutes since Greg's order, the 3 who'd held power on that flight lost everything. Meanwhile, at a Portland hotel, Cliff sat before a laptop, video calling with Dorothy Phillips and Samuel Sam Carter. Updated. They just fired all 3, Laura, Nate and Rob, within 5 minutes of your call, Sam added. The story's spreading fast, Cliff. Major outlets are covering it, and Starlight's stock is down another 7%. Cliff nodded, his gaze steady. Good, he said. But it's not enough. I want them to overhaul the whole system. Cliff switched to screen share, appearing before Starlight's board via an emergency video call. Greg had no choice but to convene. I don't need apologies, he said, his voice low but cutting. I demand comprehensive anti-discrimination training for every employee, independent oversight, to ensure change. If not, I pull my 25% stake and call on other shareholders to follow. Greg, sweating, stammered, "Will consider," but Cliff cut him off. No considering. Act, or face the consequences. The hallway they'd once strode through with confidence now held only the curious, distant stares of former colleagues. Laura clutched a box of personal items, her eyes red from crying. Nate marched out with a rigid face, and Rob, aged beyond his years, dragged a suitcase like it carried his broken career. Hours ago, they'd held authority on the flight from Memphis to Portland. Now they had nothing. Laura returned to her small apartment on Phoenix's outskirts, sitting amid debt letters and unpaid bills. She opened her laptop, hoping for new job prospects, but emails from other airlines soon piled up, all polite rejections. "We've reviewed your background, but no positions suit at this time," one read. She knew the real reason. Her name was now tied to Starlight's scandal. One in-person interview started promisingly, until the manager realized, "You're the attendant from that discrimination incident, right?" and ended it there. Laura buried her face in her hands, realizing one bad choice had torched her 8-year career. Nate, in his downtown Phoenix apartment, faced a harsh reality too. He sat among rejection emails, from big carriers like Delta to smaller regional ones. "Your experience is impressive, but we're going another direction," one said. Though Nate knew it was a dodge, Malik's video had made him the face of arrogance and bias, his flushed face threatening Clarence Cliff Turner, his haughty, "We'll make it harder." He slammed his fist on the table, muttering, all because of some stubborn old man. But deep down, he began to feel the cost of his smugness. Robert "Rob" Dawson, with 30 years of flight experience, sat in his quiet living room, staring at photos from his military pilot days. He'd been a respected captain, but now no airline would touch him, even for teaching roles. "I just followed the crew," he told himself. But the excuse rang hollow. He'd chosen silence over intervention when Cliff was wronged, and the video of his complicity had ruined him. A call from an old industry friend ended with, "Rob, you know how it is. No one wants this baggage." He slumped, feeling his age weigh on him for the first time. Meanwhile, Eleanor Ellie Prescott sat in her lavish Portland living room, watching the TV news replay the Starlight scandal. Her name echoed, "Airline Ellie," pundits dubbed her, alongside footage of her slipping money to Laura and Nate. Starlight issued her a lifetime ban, but the fallout didn't stop there. Her employer, a major real estate firm, put her under review, then on unpaid leave. Friends drifted away, avoiding the woman now branded racist online. Ellie shut off the TV, hands trembling, facing the price of the arrogance and privilege she'd taken for granted. At a Portland hotel, Cliff sat with Dorothy Phillips and Samuel Sam Carter, tracking developments via laptop. Updated, "Laura, Nate and Rob were sacked within 5 minutes of your order. Starlight's prepping the full training you demanded." Sam grinned slightly. "It's everywhere, Cliff. Their stock's down 20%, but your quick moves saved them from bankruptcy." Cliff nodded, his expression unchanged. "Justice isn't just firings," he said. "It's change. I want to make sure they don't forget." Cliff opened an email from Grace Harper, who'd sent another thank you for his stand. "I couldn't stay quiet seeing that," she wrote. "You gave me courage." He smiled faintly, replying, "Thank you, Grace. Your support made the difference." He knew today's swift justice came from people like Grace and Malik, who turned his story into a louder voice. Back in Phoenix, Laura sat in her dim apartment, recalling her averted gaze as she took Ellie's money. Nate stared at rejection emails, wondering if he'd been as right as he'd thought. Rob held an old photo, vowing never to let silence ruin him again. Ellie, in isolation, looked at her empty phone, no messages from former flatterers, each in their own way, began to feel the cost of their actions on that flight. Not just lost jobs but lost selves they'd once built. After Laura Bennett, Nathan Nate Sullivan, and Robert Rob Dawson were fired, Starlight Airlines had no choice but to face the storm Clarence Cliff Turner had unleashed. At their Phoenix, Arizona headquarters, George Greg Mitchell, the CEO, stood on the main auditorium stage, addressing hundreds of employees in an unprecedented meeting. Beside him, via video call from Portland, was Cliff, his face calm but his eyes piercing through the room. Today, Starlight Airlines failed a passenger in the worst possible way, Greg began, his voice booming through the mic. This failure isn't just an isolated incident, it's a sign of deeper issues we must address immediately and thoroughly. He paused, glancing at the screen where Cliff appeared, then continued. Every Starlight employee will undergo comprehensive anti-discrimination training before returning to work. This program, overseen by independent experts, will become a permanent part of our operations. Murmurs rippled through the auditorium. Cliff spoke up via the screen, his voice low but commanding. This isn't just about punishing those involved, he said. It's about changing your entire culture. What happened to me today was wrong, but it'd be just as wrong if I were a shareholder, a teacher, or a student heading home. The staff listened in silence, some nodding in agreement, others bowing their heads in shame for what had happened under their company's name. Greg raised a hand, signaling quiet. Starting tomorrow, he declared, Starlight Airlines will suspend all operations for 48 hours to conduct the first phase of mandatory training. Every flight, every route, every service will stop. Gasps echoed through the room. In an industry where every minute of delay costs thousands, a full shutdown was unheard of, but the message it sent, a commitment to change, was priceless. In the weeks that followed, Starlight underwent a transformation unmatched in its 30-year history. Meeting rooms nationwide turned into training hubs, from Phoenix to smaller branches. Flight schedules shifted, so every employee, from baggage handlers to Greg himself, participated. The program wasn't the usual gloss-over training staff, often ignored. Designed by behavioral psychologists, it forced them to confront their own biases through raw, challenging exercises. Cliff, from Portland, monitored closely via reports from Dorothy Phillips and Samuel Sam Carter, ensuring no one slacked off. Passengers noticed changes almost immediately. A frequent flyer at Portland Airport shared in a brief interview, "The attendants are more attentive to everyone now, no more sense of favoritism." Another said, "I got a seat mix-up, but they handled it professionally." No one was dismissed. 6 months after the incident, Starlight didn't just survive, it thrived. Passenger numbers rose 12%, employee satisfaction hit an all-time high, and the toxic culture that once festered quietly was exposed and healing. But the story didn't end with Starlight. One rainy morning in Portland, Cliff stood before the press, announcing a new initiative through his foundation, Skyward Equality. The Second Chance program, he explained, is for those who lost jobs due to bias-related incidents, offering restorative training and a path back to work. Justice isn't permanent punishment. It's a chance for those who own their mistakes and change. Among the first enrollees were Laura, Nate, and Rob. Their journeys weren't easy. Laura, in group training, shared, "I was too scared of losing my job to speak up. Now I see silence made me complicit." Nate, initially the most resistant, softened as he faced biases he hadn't acknowledged. "I grew up where looking down on others was normal," he said. "Losing everything forced me to look at myself." Rob, with his age and experience, admitted, "I trusted hierarchy over people. I'll spend my remaining years making it right." They earned certificates from the program, not erasing the past, but proof of their effort to change. Laura landed a job with a small airline, starting on the ground crew at a fraction of her old pay, but she saw it as a chance to redeem herself. Nate worked baggage handling at another carrier, slowly learning humility. Rob, no longer flying, became an instructor in Cliff's program, helping others grasp the consequences of mistakes like his. Starlight, under independent auditors, led the industry in diverse customer satisfaction. For the first time, Black, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern passengers reported experiences equal to or better than white ones. At a private meeting in Starlight's headquarters, Cliff sat via video call with Greg, reviewing 6-month progress reports. "You've shown real change," Cliff said, closing a binder of the latest stats that's worth recognizing. Greg nodded, new lines on his face reflecting months of strain. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted, "but it was necessary. What happened to you forced us to face what we'd ignored too long." Cliff stood, gazing at the Portland sky through his hotel window. He recalled 1965, when he was removed from first class, with no one to speak up. Now, he'd changed not just one flight, but an industry. He returned to Memphis, Tennessee, settling into an old armchair in his modest home, looking at family photos and his military pilot pins. He smiled faintly, not for victory, but knowing his 50-year fight had borne fruit. Starlight wasn't perfect, and real change never comes instantly, but week by week, it edged closer to the model it always advertised, where every passenger was treated like royalty, no matter who they were. Cliff, from Memphis, followed via news and reports, content to see the aviation world that once rejected him now walking the path he'd carved. Justice isn't just punishment, he told himself. It's progress. And for him, that was the greatest win. The story: Black old man removed from VIP seat for a white passenger. 5 minutes later, the entire staff is fired. Mirrors real issues still present in American society today, especially racism, the power of social media, and the importance of personal and corporate accountability. In the tale, Clarence Cliff Turner, a 70-year-old black man, is unfairly treated on a Starlight Airlines flight due to his race and age. Despite a valid ticket and major shareholder status, Eleanor Ellie Prescott's bribery, and the crew's complicity, Laura Bennett, Nathan Nate Sullivan, and Robert Rob Dawson, show how deep-seated bias can infiltrate even seemingly progressive spaces like first class. Malik Jordan and Grace Harper's viral videos, plus social media pressure, forced Starlight to fire the crew in 5 minutes and overhaul entirely, reflecting technology's and Unity's strength in demanding justice in modern America. The personal fallout for Laura, Nate, Rob, and Ellie, lost jobs, ruined reputations, and Cliff's Skyward Equality program show a society inching toward both punishment and redemption. The takeaway isn't just fighting bias, it's acting in daily life. When you see injustice, like Cliff being ousted from his seat, don't stay silent like Rob or complicit like Laura. Speak up, whether by filming like Malik or testifying like Grace, because collective power online can shift systems, as Starlight had to retrain everyone. Also, be patient and resolute like Cliff, who turned 50 years of pain into action, from shares to a support fund. Finally, if you err like Nate, face it and fix it like he did in Cliff's program, because in today's America, accountability isn't just apologies, it's real change for a fairer community. If you support justice and want to fight wrongs like Cliff Turner's story, hit that subscribe button now and drop a comment with justice and where you're watching from. Thanks for joining this journey. See you in the next video as we uncover more world-changing stories.